Just as he'd predicted, Napoleon moved himself and Josephine into the Palais de Luxembourg, occupying Louis Goyet's old ground floor apartment. The move was swift and uncomplicated. Napoleon had an incredible amount of work to do. The first order of business was to consult with his co-consuls, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and Roger Ducos, to determine who among them was to take the presidency. Meeting at the Luxembourg on November 11th, the atmosphere was tense. Sieyès fancied himself for the gig, but Ducos offered it to Napoleon, since he'd been the one to actually force through the coup the day before. Knowing that this would irk Sieyès, Napoleon proposed a compromise, as he often did. The presidency would be passed around every 24 hours, starting with Napoleon. This business decided, Napoleon used his presidential discretion to appoint a new Minister of Finance, Martin Michel Charles Godin. A seasoned and capable economist, Napoleon inquired as to his experience, at which Godin replied that he had 20 years with the Ministry of Finance. "We need your help," Napoleon then said. Quote, "Take the oath, we're in a hurry." Godin would go on to serve uninterrupted for the next 15 years. For the rest of the day, President Napoleon dominated the discussion, forming committees and starting investigations to find solutions to France's long list of lingering problems. Sieyès and Ducos were along for the ride. The dysfunction of this initial meeting hints at the tensions between the three consuls. Where before Napoleon had been courted by Sieyès, it was now Sieyès who played second fiddle to Napoleon, a total inversion of their dynamic prior to Brumaire. The two men had never liked each other, and their alliance of convenience was at an end. It was clear that they each represented two conflicting visions for the future of France. In Napoleon's estimation, Sieyès was too self-assured, commenting that, quote, "When an objection is raised to his plans, he replies as though he were inspired, and that's an end of the matter." Sieyès, on the other hand, feared Napoleon's incipient authoritarianism. He believed a strong separation of powers essential to avoid a military dictatorship. For now, Sieyès had the upper hand, as he'd written the soon-to-be-unveiled Constitution of Year 8, with which he could ensure strong separation of powers. However, when head of the 7-man Constitutional Committee, Antoine Boulet, read Sieyès' draft, he was startled to see that it was little more than a collection of notes. By candlelight and in haste, the two assembled these notes into a workable draft. At the heart of Sieyès' constitution was the office of Grand Elector, President and Prime Minister rolled into one. Naturally, he imagined himself as Grand Elector, whose main job it would be to wrangle the consuls, in this case Napoleon and Ducos. The power to remove the Grand Elector would be placed in the hands of the upper house of a bicameral legislature, stuffed full with the usual fare of property bourgeoisie. Though Sieyès believed his constitution a triumph, reception, especially among the political class, was less than stellar. There was little to distinguish this cumbersome and lofty document from the outgoing Constitution of Year 3, one of the big problems of which was that it was near impossible to amend. One of the main promises of Brumaire was that this kind of obstacle could be vaulted by an unencumbered executive. The quiet champion of this viewpoint was Napoleon, who, though of course sought power for himself, did not seek the position for power's own sake. Ducos was a pretty insipid character, and Sieyès too idealistic. Thus, his own ambition and the growing desire of the government naturally co-aligned. As November wore on into December, Sieyès' support drained away to join Napoleon. Of course, Napoleon kept his hands clean, relying upon his brothers, Lucien and Joseph, to make the backroom deals and bribes that poached, among others, Boulet, Pierre Danou, Pierre Roederer, and most crucially, Jean-Jacques Cambacérès. Other allies among the Rump Councils and the Constitutional Committee proved their worth by obfuscating Sieyès' plans. By early December, they'd attained enough support to motion that Napoleon be granted extraordinary dictatorial powers for 10 years. Thus, the office of Grand Elector was replaced by that of the First Consul, who would be advised by the legislature but not bound to it. The fight over the shape of the Constitution came to a head on December 13th. The Constitutional Committee convened for their final session, ready to present a finished draft. And what they presented was nothing less than Napoleon's own vision. His allies had pruned and trimmed much of Sieyès' separation of powers to leave an empowered executive. Over the previous week or so, the Constitution had been rewritten under Sieyès' nose whilst he was out of Paris. These edits did not go unnoticed, but by the time Sieyès returned, it was clear he'd been outmaneuvered. Beaten, he took a bribe offered by Lucien or Bouillet, the presidency of the Senate, a cash payout, and an elegant estate in Versailles. Thus, when Sieyès was asked to nominate who the 3 directors might be, he declined to run, claiming officially that this was his retirement. Ducos folded too, accepting 100,000 francs and the vice presidency of the Senate. So with Sieyès and Ducos removed in a second bloodless coup, only a month after the first, It only remained for Napoleon to complete his power grab by inaugurating the Constitution. On the 15th, he announced to the nation, "To the people of France, a constitution is presented to you. It is based upon the true principles of representative government, of equality, of liberty. The powers it provides the executive are strong and stable, as they must be in order to guarantee the rights of the citizens and the interests of the nation. Citizens, the revolution is now anchored to the principles which created it. The revolution is finished." That line about the revolution being finished was no mere flourish. Napoleon genuinely did believe that the revolution, which had started on a tennis court in Versailles just over 10 years ago, was now over. The time had come for France to discard the fractious conflicts of the past decade and unite. To begin, Article 1 restated the foundational ethos of the French Republic, that it was one and indivisible. Articles 2 to 6 define the rights and requirements of citizenship, with Articles 7 to 14 describing how the new system of presentational voting would work. Basically, at the local level, a universal male vote produced a list of 10% of their own communal electorate to serve as notables. These notables were then whittled down to another 10% of their original number at the departmental level. Then this list was whittled away again by a vote at the national level to produce a list of a few hundred delegates to the legislature. The upper house of this bicameral legislature was explained by Articles 15 through 24. Called the Conservative Senate, it would consist of 80 delegates for an exclusive lifetime appointment. Their main job was to select from the departmental and national list those who could serve in the various branches of government, save for the executive. Below the Senate was the lower house, comprised of two institutions whose scope was laid out in Articles 25 through 38. The first was a 100-delegate tribunate. Their job was to discuss laws proposed by the government, however they lacked the ability to veto these laws. A law would then pass from the tribunate to the 300-strong legislative body. Sitting for 4 months and voting by secret ballot, they'd consider a law's constitutionality, not its merit. After this, the law passed to the Senate, and as per Article 21, it could, quote, sustain or annul any decrees from below. The Senate also reserved the sole right to amend the Constitution, something not even the consul could do. Eventually, this power would morph into the ability to issue a binding decree if the Senate's majority were on board. All laws and proposals to be debated by the legislature derive from on high, from the executive. But rather than create these proposals in a vacuum, Napoleon envisioned the executive working closely with a small technocratic advisory body called the Council of State. Though the council had only limited powers, their recommendations were to be taken quite seriously, especially since Napoleon handpicked the first 50 of their members. Apart from 6 officers, he chose almost exclusively 2 types of civilian: scientists and bureaucrats. The idea was that these intelligent and capable thinkers would be something of a brain's trust to staff the ministries and aid the executive. And as for the executive, the Constitution had plenty to say in Articles 39 through 51. Just as the consulate was to function as a hierarchy, so too did the executive. Of the 3 consuls, Napoleon, as first consul, was to have near total control. The other 2 men named as consuls, the jovial Cambacérès and the by-the-book Charles-François Lebrun, had merely consultative roles. All laws, decrees and proposals stemmed from the first consul. All decisions pertaining to diplomacy, war and foreign policy would ultimately lie with the consul. The government's ministries and their ministers would answer to the first consul. Ultimate power lay with the first consul and no one else. As far as the legal system was concerned, just like with the executive, things were very concentrated. As expected, a uniform legal code bound the nation, with a local and national level defined. Judges sat in lifetime appointment, passing judgment in accordance with this code. But where before the French legal code had been based upon the rights of man, no such provisions were made in 1799. Civil rights were no longer explicit, but more generally defined in common law. The only place actual rights were defined was in Articles 76 through to 94, the general provisions. We'll visit a few of these articles over the next few episodes. As for governance, ministers and officials were bound as public servants to best serve the nation. However, they were only liable for criminal penalties if the Council of State decreed. This meant that in effect, the first consul could make every salaried public servant answerable to him if they wanted to keep their job. An indirect, softer method of control was imposed, with strict financial oversight. Taxation was taken from the departments and made the purview of Minister Gaudin and the Ministry of Finance. This gave Paris very direct control over revenue and clamped down on corruption. So, in evaluating the Constitution of Year 8, I think it's fair to say that it is, by far, the most conservative of the French constitutions we've seen so far. However, it was still undeniably inspired by the Revolution. The mere fact that there was a constitution proves this point. Like all the constitutions we've seen so far, at its core, the legitimacy of the government stemmed from popular sovereignty. Even had Napoleon wished, he could not rule without popular approval. And this was very much to his liking. Napoleon's brand of authoritarianism was firmly in the realm of enlightened despotism. Quite succinctly, Boulay described this system, quote, "Confidence comes from below, power from above." The sacrifice made, however, was to French democracy. The deliberately circumspect and complicated voting system, an upper house, and the elevation of men of property were body blows to political democracy. It was the opinion of Napoleon and those in government that a controlled democracy like this was the acceptable middle ground between the populism of 1793 and the tyranny of the Ancien Regime. The Constitution was a triumph for Napoleon, but it was just the beginning of a greater project. With the revolution over, the divisions of the past set aside, he believed it was high time for France to truly reunite, a process he called ralliement. At the third session of the Council of State on December 25th, held at the Luxembourg, the Constitution was unveiled in a grand ceremony, and unity was the overriding theme. A commensurate campaign of popularization was commenced to gratify the French people. To help the little folk, old holidays were reinstated, and certain rights, like the inviolability of one's home, enshrined in the Constitution. They also benefited mightily from an active gendarmerie, expanded to around 16,500 on Napoleon's orders. Banditry, which had plagued the countryside, was quashed without mercy. By comparison, treatment of the Vendée rebels was gentle, and they were offered a general amnesty and freedom of worship if they swore an oath to the Constitution. Some accepted, while those who did not were annihilated. Ingratiating the middle class was similarly successful. They appreciated Napoleon's reformist edge, focusing on administrative and economic problems, as well as the fact that 3,000 of the old, corrupt and incompetent judges were dismissed in March of 1800. Similar purges occurred at all levels of the administration, freeing up a slew of jobs for a new generation of eager and talented bureaucrats. Getting the upper class on side took a bit more doing. Here, divisions were at their strongest: Royalists and Jacobins, Thermidorians and Feuillants. Napoleon's offering was to reconcile them all. Old factional affiliations did not impede one's ability to score a comfy gig in the legislature or the government, and members of former governments, stretching all the way back to the Ancien Regime to those ousted at the coup of Prairial, were welcomed with open arms. Of this policy of no-strings-attached reconciliation, Napoleon said that he did not care whether someone was, quote, a Royalist, Chouan, Jacobin, Feuillant, or any one of those 1,001 denominations which have sprung from 10 years of factionalism. All he cared about was their loyalty to France. Would you serve or would you hinder? Of course, the truly unreconcilable, like the jaded neo-Jacobins or Bourbon legitimists, were excluded. But most were willing to bury the hatchet if it meant stability, under a political arrangement that they could all broadly agree was acceptable. Émigrés and non-juring priests were also invited back as an olive branch to the Royalists, though like with the neo-Jacobins, both were kept at arm's length. Napoleon publicly stated that they would not get their former lands back, but they could resettle in France assured of full citizenship. In October 1800, 48,000 émigrés were removed from France's blacklist, and over the next few years, nearly 100,000 would return. But of all the things Napoleon did, or could or would do, to curry favour, none were more successful or more appreciated than those that righted the economy. This success was a confluence of two factors. Firstly, administrative reforms that cut through a whole lot of red tape, and second, the fine work of Minister Gaudin. So to skip ahead a little bit, in February of 1800, a new system of departmental administration was adopted across France. Taking a leaf both from the Ancien Regime, with their intendants, and the revolutionaries with their representatives on mission, the departments were to be overseen by prefects. The prefecture operated on 3 tiers, just like with voting. There would be a single prefect per department, below them a sub-prefect overseeing the arrondissement, and then mayors below them, who govern the communes. Moreover, the prefects were inducted into the Conseil de Préfecture, from where they would offer advice and recommendations to the central government. One of the first things they recommended, and which was taken up right away, was the addition of 20 new departments to be added onto the existing 83. By appointing a trusted prefect, the consulate supported the departments to Paris, exerting control down to every last one of the 36,000 communes across France. Though this demolished one of the last bastions of French democracy, it did have the benefit of slicing through red tape and centralizing decision-making. For instance, Napoleon, ever the micromanager, stipulated to Lucien, the new Minister of the Interior, that all the communes were to be put into one of 10 categories, varying by how much of an asset they were to the nation. After 5 years, he expected them all to be either net positive or have a balanced budget. Such efforts greatly aided Gaudin. With consistent tax collection squared away, he was in a good position to secure favourable loans from the Paris bankers. With a new campaign likely for 1800, and the treasury quite literally empty, Napoleon reluctantly ordered 12 million francs to be borrowed. Gaudin could only get 3, so Napoleon had one of the bankers arrested and squeezed for every coin he had. The bankers soon saw reason. But having to rely upon the notoriously stingy Paris bankers was a weakness Napoleon sought immediately to remedy. A national bank was needed, so on February 13th, the Banque de France opened its doors. Part of what recommended the bank was its independence. It was to be privately funded, separate from the government. The startup capital of 30 million francs was reached quickly, boosted by confidence in Gaudin, and Napoleon calling in every favour he could to get friends, family and allies to invest. The 1st of January 1800 was not a remarkable day as per the revolutionary calendar, but it did mark the first time the legislature met in full. They were there largely to accept the Constitution of Year 8, and to organise the national plebiscite that would see it approved by the French people. In late January and into February, the vote was conducted under Lucien's watchful eye. On February 7th, he announced the results. Just over 3 million votes were counted in favour, with a minuscule 1,562 counted against. Widespread doctoring of votes and fraud explains this truly wild result. Lucien used some very questionable maths to estimate the expected results for entire regions. The 500,000 positive votes from the army he just made up. Even at the time, these numbers seemed deeply suspicious, but despite this, Napoleon could claim some democratic mantle. This vote was just as much a referendum on Napoleon as a plebiscite on the Constitution, and Andrew Roberts estimates around 1.5 million favourable votes to a few thousand negative. So it was, with the home front well and truly secure, that Napoleon could now devote himself fully to that most formidable of tasks, crushing the Second Coalition. Among the very first letters Napoleon dispatched after becoming first consul was a message to King George III asking for peace. To His Majesty George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland. Is the war that for 8 years past, which has devastated the 4 corners of the world, to be eternal? Is there no possibility of coming to an agreement? How can the 2 most enlightened nations in Europe, both more powerful than necessary to secure their own safety and independence, sacrifice so much to some vague notion of superiority, our shared interest in commerce, internal prosperity, and the happiness of our people? How can we fail to see that peace is the first necessity and the greatest of glories? Your Majesty must see in this overture nothing but my sincere desire by prompt action to contribute efficaciously to a general peace. A similar and remarkably calm letter, considering Austrian backstabbing, was also sent to Vienna. To His Majesty Franz II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary and Bohemia, Archduke of Austria. Once more, after an absence of 18 months, I returned to Europe to find war raging between the French Republic and your Majesty. The French nation has summoned me to the consulship. Far as I am from any vainglorious sentiments, my greatest desire is to prevent the spilling of more blood. Your Majesty's reputation leaves me in no doubt as to your most heartfelt desire for peace. If that sentiment has given its course, I do not doubt that we can conciliate the interests of our 2 countries. Of course, neither the Austrians nor the British were about to make peace. Though the Russians were out of the Second Coalition, Austria had still overrun Italy. A return to the borders of Campo Formio were bunk now that they had France by the balls. And as for Britain, well, parliamentary politicking in Westminster assured war would continue. Generally speaking, a consensus had been reached whereby Britain would be satisfied if France was simply contained and unable to export the revolution. An outright Bourbon restoration was deemed increasingly unlikely, especially since opinion in Britain favoured some sort of constitutional compromise, much like their own glorious revolution of 1688. In how best to achieve these aims, there were 2 camps. Henry Dundas, Secretary of State, preferred a naval and colonial strategy, to bleed France white until a peaceable compromise. The Tories, on the other hand, mostly stood behind an acolyte of William Pitt the Younger, Foreign Secretary William Grenville. His was a vision for total victory via a continental strategy, strong cooperation with European partners, and an eventual march on Paris. In his response to Napoleon, Grenville countered that a peace in Europe would only be a possibility if the Bourbons were restored. Now, Napoleon had actually received just such an offer from Louis XVIII, now exiled to Riga. The throneless king demanded, albeit quite politely, that Napoleon facilitate his restoration in exchange for a statue. Yes, quite literally a statue. Of course, Napoleon politely declined, and with that also rebuffed Grenville. Though French attempts at peace were quite genuine, Napoleon was happy enough to extract these negative replies. He could legitimately claim to have done his best to achieve a peace diplomatically, meaning that when he revealed the backhandedness of Turgot and Grenville, public opinion swelled in favour of war, especially against perfidious Albion. People of France, you want peace. Know your government desires it even more than you do. Our first hope, our constant endeavour, has been to secure peace. But the English government has betrayed the secret of its horrible policy, to tear France asunder, to destroy her navy and her ports, to efface her name from Europe. England aims to divide the nations of the continent so as to seize their commerce and enrich themselves on the spoils. The First Consul has promised peace. He will achieve it at the head of the veterans, who once more will be led to victory. He swears to fight for nothing but the happiness of France and the repose of the world. Of this shrewd move, Napoleon later confided, quote, "If France had made peace at that time, she would have made it after a series of disasters. This would have been dishonourable, and encouraged others to take advantage. All the chances of the 1800 campaign were in our favour." So war it would be. When we last saw the strategic picture in October 1799, France had won a series of victories in Holland and Switzerland that stabilised their northern front. The Russians had quit the coalition and the British were entirely ejected from the continent, save for some detachments in Italy. This left Italy as France's exposed underbelly. Here, the experienced army of elderly Austrian general Michael von Melas was focused on cracking the last bastions of French defence in Italy. After battering Andrea Massena, Melas broke west towards the Maritime Alps, threatening France proper. It was the opinion of the French generals and their Austrian counterparts that the majority of French attention would now be focused on defending their borders. A counteroffensive was a ludicrous idea. But Napoleon was not so convinced. Poring over the maps with General Barclay-L'Albe, the two drew up plans for a downright reckless counteroffensive. The plan was to cross the Alps, descend into the fertile Piedmont plains, and sever Melas' lines back to Vienna. If Napoleon could pull it off, he wouldn't just win the war, he'd make history. In February 1800, the army with which Napoleon intended to accomplish this incredible feat didn't even exist. France had an on-paper strength of nearly 400,000, but only 285,000 were dispersed among the 5 active field armies. All were in varying states of disrepair, but with a free hand, Napoleon quickly set about remedying these problems from December onwards. Apart from a spate of resupply and reinforcement, drastically improving supply throughput and military efficiency, the armies were reorganised from the top down. The armies of the Rhine and the Danube were formed into one mighty force, around 120,000 men, and command given over to General Victor Moreau. It was Moreau's expectation, as indeed was the Austrians', that if an attack was launched, his German campaign would be the main effort. His orders from Napoleon from December 18th, claiming that on the campaign rested, quote, "our best hope for peace," certainly left no doubts. But Moreau was a cautious creature, and also bore a strong professional rivalry with Napoleon. Plans forwarded from the consul to ford the Rhine and get behind the Austrians holding the Schwarzwald, Moreau chose to countermand. Instead, he decided to rerun almost the exact same plays as Jourdan from previous years. This encouraged Napoleon to see Italy, not the Rhineland, as the theatre in which the decisive blow against Austria would be struck. In a flash of temper, Napoleon snapped at one of Moreau's staff, quote, "What he dares not do on the Rhine, I shall do over the Alps." But time was running short. Across the Alps, the army of Italy was outnumbered and outgunned. There were about 40,000 of them between Massena and Louis-Gabriel Suchet, barely holding on in Liguria. The desperate need to reinforce these armies compelled Napoleon to break up General Gabriel Edelville's Army of England. Some of these brigades reinforced Guillaume Brun's Army of the Interior, which was then used to stamp out the last embers of rebellion in the Vendée. By around February of 1800, enough brigades had been freed up for Napoleon to order the formation of a new army, the army with which he intended to invade Italy. It's worth noting that around this time, Napoleon ordered the armies to adopt the system of the Corps d'Armée, an evolution on the existing system of brigades. I'll talk at some length about what this means as it becomes more relevant in 1804, but for now it's enough to know that where before we were looking at divisions, we'll now mostly be looking at corps. Each corps was intended to function as a self-sufficient combined arms army, but in smaller independent units, more mobile and useful than a full-sized army. On March 3rd, the Army of the Reserve assembled at Dijon, and on paper it was to serve just as what it said on the tin, a strategic reserve. It was important to disguise the army's true purpose, as Napoleon did not want the many Austrian spies operating in France to report back that a new offensive army was being readied for battle. So to maintain this fiction, around half of the 30,000 strong army was composed of raw recruits. Overseeing this training was Alexandre Berthier. He had been made Minister of War, where he served very capably, but Napoleon now needed him to train the troops. Taking over the war ministry was Lazare Carnot, clearly unperturbed by his ousting at Prairial. Fine taskmaster that he was, Berthier whipped the reserve into shape with months of relentless drilling. The veterans, many of whom had served in Italy or the Orient, and fresh conscripts, were wisely amalgamated into small bivouacs, 16 in total, 8 veterans and 8 conscripts. Little bits of theatre convinced the Austrians that the reserve was no threat, even as its numbers reached 60,000 by April. Shoddily equipped units were paraded through Paris, and reports of unruly conscripts spread, successfully tricking the Austrians into believing that the reserve would never see action. Preparations for Napoleon's campaign were given new import as news trickled in of another disaster in Italy. Despite his best efforts, Massena was crushed by Melas in an April offensive. By the 19th, Massena was besieged in Genoa with about 12,000 of his bedraggled troops. Suchet escaped with most of the rest. Of course, Napoleon was rearing to go, but there was still much to prepare, and his days were extremely busy. Dictation, meetings at the Luxembourg, or attendance at parades and public functions took up all of his time. In a 10-day decade, a decade functioning like a week, he met with the Ministry of Finance on the first day. On the 4th, he convened the Ministry of War and whatever generals he wanted to talk to. On day 6, the Navy was discussed. On day 8, the Judiciary. Days for foreign affairs, domestic policy, and police matters were also slotted in. To keep everything straight in his mind, Napoleon devised an enviable little method of mnemonic memory. He imagined something like a filing cabinet. When he wanted to move from one topic to another, he simply, quote, pushed in its file and pulled out another. When finished with the day, he said, quote, if I wish to sleep, I push in all files at once, and I'm asleep. On April 24th, only 5 days after Massena's entrapment, Napoleon ordered Berthier and his Army of the Reserve to march on Geneva. The divisions marched dispersed to avoid suspicion, and found before them depots topped to the brim with rationed biscuits and ammunition. The soldiers stocked up on 9 days of food and 40 cartridges each. Now they only had to wait for their general. Napoleon was back in Paris, working mostly out of Malmaison. On the night of May 5th, he ended another busy day with a date at the opera. Only hours later, he was in Dijon, having stolen out of Paris before anybody knew anything was amiss. Not even the legislature was informed, such was the level of secrecy. Joining the army in Geneva at midnight on the 8th, Napoleon revealed his plans to Berthier. Moreau's offensive across the Rhine had already begun. Reports from the Battle of Stockach were good, so across the Alps it would be. There were 4 Alpine passes leading from Switzerland into Italy, 2 at St. Gothard and 2 at St. Bernard. Already a vanguard had been sent along the preferred path at St. Bernard. This force of 8 to 10,000, led by Jean Lannes, was to seize Aosta, no matter the cost. 2 corps were then formed from the rest of the army. The first was led by General Philibert Duhamel, the second led by Claude Victor. On the 14th, Napoleon set out from Geneva with the Consular Guard under Jean-Baptiste Bessieres, a division under Jean-Charles Monnier, 48 guns in the care of General Auguste Marmont, and the entire cavalry force, led by Joachim Murat. Only a day before departing, a letter arrived from good comrade Louis de Say. Released by the Brits along with Louis-Nicolas Davout, he was on his way to the front. General Alexandre Dumas, in Murat's division, expressed his doubts as to the crossing. Napoleon consoled him, quote, so long as there are places a soldier can step, an army may pass anywhere. Though the crossing was timed perfectly for the summer thaw, St. Bernard was still a real bitch to cross. No modern army had ever attempted a crossing with their entire baggage train. Napoleon would be the first, joining the ranks of Hannibal and Charlemagne. What made it possible was not just the grit of the army, but solid preparations. Well provisioned, Napoleon's men trudged along single file, and only at night so as to avoid avalanches, as per Chief Engineer Marescot's instructions. The horses were up to their fetlocks in snow, so the cannons and 100 or more wagons were dragged along in hollowed-out logs or skis designed by the engineers. At steep passes at Saint-Pierre, teams of 100 men hauled the heaviest equipment. After cresting the Alpine summit at the Col on May 18th, the journey down the mountains was much easier than the almost sheer French and Swiss sides. Trusty Laon had taken Aosta on the 16th, but after this he faced intense resistance. The defences at Fort Bard Napoleon and his officers feared would be a nasty obstacle. And sure enough, Melas had been prudent enough to leave 400 Hungarian troops under Captain Josef Bernkopf. The French infantry could scrape by, but the baggage train was delayed by 12 days. Bernkopf would only surrender, after running out of all ammunition, on June 2nd. Following behind in a sure-footed mule and draped in a thick grey overcoat, Napoleon reached Berthier near Bard on May 20th. Ordering Berthier to get the baggage train through, Napoleon then set off after Lannes, who occupied Ivrea on the 22nd. Here too, Laon faced unexpected resistance, but this was expeditiously dealt with so that by the 24th, 40,000 men, the bulk of the Army of the Reserve, was spilling out onto the fertile plains of Piedmont, quote, like a thunderbolt, as Napoleon wrote to his brother Joseph. Before them were around 86,000 Austrian troops. Melas himself was with the main force pushing west towards Toulon after taking Nice from General Suchet. General Peter Ott besieged Messina in Genoa. With the Austrians committed, there were only a few thousand troops who stood between Napoleon and Turin. Taken completely by surprise, Melas quit his advance and ordered Ott to rejoin him for a march on Alessandria. But Napoleon would not wait around to be pincered. He expected Messina to be able to hold out until June 4th. This meant there were 10 days in which to win the War of Maneuver. So rather than rush south to bail out Messina, as expected, Napoleon marched east towards Milan. It was a dangerous gamble. Milan was a long way away, and to get there fast, the French were forced to march in long, vulnerable columns. To mask these movements, Laon menaced Turin from Chivasso, thereby occupying Austrian attentions as the Army of the Reserve struck deep to their rear. Marat's cavalry fanned out, taking Vercelli on the 27th. Duhamel's corps was across in Novara by the night of the 29th. From the headquarters in Ivrea, Napoleon surveyed their progress with glee. He boasted that he'd be back in Paris in just a few days. With most of the remaining 20,000 troops safely over the Alps, Napoleon raced east to Navarra to catch up to the advanced units. On June 2nd, he was in Milan, entering via the Vercelli Gate. Despite their shock, the Milanese weren't even aware the French were still in Italy. The crown jewel of Lombardy gave Napoleon a hero's welcome for the second time in his career. Setting up shop in the ducal palace, you'd think Napoleon would be laser-focused on the campaign, but it was not so. Political prisoners incarcerated by the Austrians were released, one among them being a familiar face, that of Francesco de Auril. Capable and loyal, Auril was made the head of the provisional government in Milan as a prelude to re-establishing the Cisalpine Republic. Lannes took Pavia and reinforcements arrived from St. Gothard under General Jean Moncey. Napoleon also sent Maurice Talleyrand, reinstated as foreign minister, instructions to publish propaganda lambasting the Austrians, and even specified the exact amount to be spent on gifts for the Spanish king. There were also private letters Napoleon sent, some to friends and family, and one sent to Bernadotte, goading that the Austrians were all but finished. The boast was premature. After weeks of siege in bitter, squalid conditions, Massena surrendered Genoa. All in all, he'd done extremely well to last as long as he had, but the capture of General Jean Soult, a Royal Navy blockade, and the total lack of food rendered any further resistance untenable. Ott's decision to ignore orders from his superior, Melas, were clearly well founded, but he still had to rejoin quickly, so Ott gave good terms just to get the siege over and done with. The French were allowed to march home, but obviously Napoleon was less than pleased. Initially he disbelieved reports from Bourrienne, but after realizing their authenticity, had to face the fact that Melas' full strength was free to regroup and counterattack from the south. Just like that, Napoleon's campaign had pivoted to one of strategic defense. But as ever, his plan was the embodiment of the old saying, the best defense is a good offense. The idea now was to steal the march on Melas, and set up somewhere near Alessandria and goad them into a costly attack. Marat, followed by Lannes, had already forged a beachhead on June 5th near Piacenza, from where both Laon and Victor streamed across the Po. They assembled in Stradella, but here confusion reigned. Berthier, in overall tactical command as Napoleon was still in Milan, confounded his subordinates with orders that clouded the advance in confusion. Lannes and Victor were sent on a wild goose chase, before finally converging to crush an Austrian force at Correggio. Hours later, as the Army of the Reserve moved west, over stems from the River Bormida, Berthier botched the placement of the pontoon bridges. Frustrated, Lannes followed Berthier's orders in spirit alone, trusting instead his aggressive instincts. They were right on the money. Ott, defending the river crossings, was engaged by Lannes near Montebello. In a brilliant and unexpected little victory, Lannes pinned Ott's 18,000 with an 8,000 strong corps of his own, while 5,000 reinforcements from Victor crashed into their rear. Broken, Austrian survivors fled west and north. Napoleon crossed the Po on the night of the 9th, his gut telling him that since Ott retreated towards Alessandria, Melas had to be nearby. Urgent dispatches were sent back to Pavia ordering the rest of the corps to meet at Stradella. Heavy rain impeded progress, so it was not until the night of the 11th that the French were assembled. Napoleon could count on 4 corps, that of Duhamel, Lannes, Victor, and a 4th formed from 2 divisions, so 6 demi-brigades, given over to the recently arrived General Desaix. Though the army of the reserve numbered a good 60,000, the actual striking force at Stradella was only around 30,000 strong, and they'd be going up against a far larger Austrian army. Fortunately for Napoleon, Melas stayed put near Alessandria. Fearing that he might retreat back to Genoa, Napoleon struck like lightning. After the timely arrival of the rest of the artillery, for a grand total of 41 guns, the army of the reserve forded the river Scrivia on the 13th and occupied favourable ground just south of Alessandria. Melas was now in a tight spot. Suchet was advancing from the west with a large force, and Desaix threatened to cut off the path to Genoa. Faced with this dilemma, Napoleon expected Melas to retreat, since he had so easily surrendered the ground around Scrivia, flat farmland that favoured the Austrians' sizable advantage in cavalry. Subsequent reports, based on faulty reconnaissance and the word of a double agent, did nothing to disprove this theory. In fact, Napoleon was so sure Melas wouldn't strike south that he dispersed his corps east to west across the river Bormida, looking for a crossing, leaving only Victor's corps to hold the village of Marengo. It was to prove a costly blunder. Melas had determined to prevent the conjuncture of Suchet and Napoleon with a rapid advance. Concealed by the rain and the dark, on the night of the 13th, the Austrian army crossed the Bormida in complete secrecy. General Gaspard Gardin, with a handful of units numbering around 3,000, was shocked when, not long before dawn, cannon fire boomed overhead. Covered by 100 guns, General Andreas O'Reilly had established a bridgehead, centred on the village of Petabona. 18,000 Austrian troops then flooded across in the early hours of the morning. But rather than marching rapidly to maximise the effect of their surprise, the Austrians took the time to form up into 3 orderly columns. This meandering process was slowed even more by mud, which had congealed to form a thick gelatin that impeded both sides. By the time the Austrians did begin their attack, at around 6 am, Gardin, Jean Chamberlac, and various units from Victor's corps held the ravine of the Fontenone that stretched from Marengo all the way north. This natural barrier held the Austrians back for hours. The chance for a quick breakout was lost, but Melas still had the numerical advantage. Relentless attacks smashed into the French line, grinding them down and forcing them back. 3 miles to the east, at Garfoli, Napoleon could see and hear the battle unfolding, but was convinced it was just a diversion to cover the retreat. That was until reports flooded in, and kept flooding in, detailing the dire situation. It had taken a while for Napoleon to realise that this was no diversion. Acting decisively, orders went out recalling Desaix and a division under La Poype. Then Lannes and Marat, closer to hand, were put into the fight. Their arrival with fresh brigades, marching to the sound of La Marseillaise, bolstered the flagging centre. But the north was now exposed. Ott had a clear path to Castelceriolo. If taken, the Austrians would be able to descend on the French rear. Racing to the front on horseback at 11 am, Napoleon sent Meunier's division into the breach at Castelceriolo. General Claude Saint-Cyr's light brigade just barely outpaced the Austrians and occupied the village. Before long though, in level farmland ideal for cavalry, Meunier found his advance thwarted. Disaster was only narrowly averted when Napoleon committed the last of his reserve, the 900-strong Consular Guard. Marching by square into the gap between Meunier and the main line, they fended off dozens of attacks from Austrian cavalry. Exposed as they were out in the fields, over half were dead or wounded by day's end, but they held, giving Meunier the space he needed to block Ott. For 3 more hours, the fighting at the Fontenone raged. 40 Austrian guns rained down hell, but the French gave them hell right back, even pissing on their overheated muskets to keep up the fire. Napoleon bolted along the line, exhorting the men and steadying the line. By 1 p.m, most of Victor's ammunition was spent. Gardin broke as Archduke Joseph, leading an assault personally, broke through the Fontenone and captured Marengo. An immediate French counterattack was beaten back with heavy losses, as Joseph fortified the village. This rupture in the French line triggered a cascading effect. all down the line, embattled brigades began to slowly fall back to San Giuliano, 5 miles to the east. Here, nearing 2 p.m, was the turning point of the battle. There was no way the French would hold out until night. They would either bend or break. So assured of victory, Melas retired, having suffered a gash to his forearm when not one but 2 horses were shot out from under him. Command was handed over to General Anton von Zach. Melas was in error to presume the battle won so soon. Though the French were reeling, help was at hand. Galloping ahead of his corps, Desaix greeted Napoleon, quipping that the battle was lost, but since it was only 3 p.m, there was time for another. An hour later, and Desaix's artillery joined the 14 already in action. Marmont's batteries tore into the Austrian flanks as they had advanced, Grapeshot managing to land a lucky hit on Austrian ammunition wagons. Just like at Rivoli's Asteria Gorge, a chunk of the assault columns were vaporized. But unlike at Rivoli, this shock did not precede a rout. Rather, the very best of the Austrian army, the Hungarian Grenadiers, fired one last volley and charged, all 6,000 of them. The French struggled to hold this sudden attack until a young hussar swooped in. Etienne Kellerman, rallying 3 battalions of the 2nd Hussars, charged the enemy on his own initiative. Since the Grenadiers had already fired their muskets, they were caught completely unprepared. 400 sword-swinging hussars sliced their way to the rear and still had enough momentum to rout the Austrian cavalry. Zach's forces were disintegrating. Lannes reeled around from the north to cut off the escape. Bessieres charged in headlong with a guard. Desaix plunged in for the coup de grace. And it was from the head of his column that Desaix was struck by a musket ball, killing him on the spot. He died around 9 p.m, the Battle of Marengo already won. Melas had begun the battle on the morning of June 14th with 30,000 troops. That same night, a gloomy evening in the fortress of Alessandria, he was down to less than half. On the wrong side of the Bormida lay 6,000 killed and wounded, 8,000 captured, along with 40 guns and 15 colours. Given the totality of the defeat, Melas sent word to Napoleon that he was willing to talk terms. As per the subsequent Convention of Alessandria, the remaining Austrians withdrew east of the Ticino and surrendered Piedmont and Lombardy. In a single battle, the Italian campaign of 1800 had been won. Though the cost had been severe, around 4,000 French killed and wounded at Marengo and several thousand more at Genoa, it was far fewer than would have been lost in a longer, drawn-out campaign. The choice to drive over Milan had been the right call. What weighed on Napoleon was the loss of his friend Desaix. He reported back to Paris, "A grave loss for the army and for the Republic takes all joy from our victory." Desaix was struck by a bullet just as his division went into action. He lived just long enough to say to a young Lebrun, "Go tell the first consul that I die regretting that I have not lived long enough to be regarded in posterity." He had joined the headquarters only 3 days before. He was ardent and brave. When the first consul was brought news of Desaix's death, he merely said, "Why may I not weep?" Barely was Desaix's body cold, and Napoleon was putting words in his mouth. He never said anything to Lebrun, but Napoleon couldn't resist embellishing the narrative of Marengo. He'd go on to Dr. Berthier's official account not once, not twice, but 3 times over the next 15 years. Truth be, Marengo was a bloody close fight. Napoleon had done well to commit his reserves as he did, but it was the vital actions of so many subordinates, like Desaix and Kellerman, like Sancy and Gardanne, that clinched the win. It is often said of Marengo that it was 2 battles. Napoleon lost the first, but he won the second. Praising the army in the aftermath, Napoleon met with several of the day's heroes. Jean Rapp and Jean-Marie Savary were inducted into Napoleon's staff. Bessieres of the Consular Guard was lauded for his valiant stand. Berthier too was thanked. Since he was commander of the Army of the Reserve, the victory was technically his. Kellerman received little acknowledgement at the time, but Napoleon did admit to Bourrienne the next day that, quote, "Little Kellerman made a lucky charge in the nick of time. To think, great events turn on such things." Kellerman was a general de division within a month, and his future indiscretions would go largely ignored. 8 months had passed since Napoleon's elevation to first consul. In less than a year, he'd gone from just one of several talented generals to the most powerful man in France, the future of the Republic in his hands. Though Marengo was a stunning victory, Napoleon was wise not to rest on his laurels. Lasting glory would come from the peace he'd promised to the people of France.